Yeah, 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 I run my fingers through her hair as she smiles and says that she loves me. Isn't it lovely when the one you lusting is the one you're loving?
You've written a couple of books in the reckoning, and I'm really excited because you have a PhD, you're into psychiatry, psychology, you study the mind. That's your discipline. And I don't know where we are right now as a nation, but I know reckoning has to be part of it. There has to be an atonement. We were talking yesterday on my show. Actually, we were talking last week on my show about karma. And I was having this discussion with Tyler Merritt, who's also an author. He wrote I Take My Coffee Black. And we were talking about, in order for there to be any kind of, reckoning in your life, you have to atone for the things you've done, which means you have to accept the things you've done. And we were talking about the 12-step plan, I guess, when you're going through recovery, one of the first steps, admitting you have a problem, but you also have to record all the people you've harmed and go and make amends. This country has not done that. And you write about it in your book, in your last book.
When I started writing or getting the idea for my second book, I thought I was going to be writing about post-COVID America in terms of like the massive mental health crisis we were going to be facing, which of course we are facing. But then I realized that that's kind of impossible to do because it's so individual how people are suffering or handling it or not handling it. So I realized what the most important thing we need to do as a country, and this has the fact that we failed so miserably is partially why we ended up with somebody like Donald, and why we responded so horribly to COVID is because America has never, or I should say, sorry, white America has never, ever owned up to its egregious failures to acknowledge, let alone atone for, its history of white supremacy and its refusal to deal with white privilege in a way that's constructive. So here we are, we look at what happened in Georgia in this Senate runoff, and the fact that Herschel Walker, one was put forward as a candidate, which was a deeply cynical thing for white Republicans to do, but got so many votes and actually made it a close race, is it, in my view, a serious indictment of how little work white America has done to level the playing field. And I don't want people walking around feeling guilty, but for white Americans, especially those of us who were raised in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to fail to acknowledge our racism is part of the problem, because if you fail to acknowledge your racism and how you participate in a deeply racist system, then you become part of the problem, no matter what your good intentions might be. But white people are cowards when it comes to that kind of thing.
I think we all are. So I don't, and again, whiteness is a made up construct. So if you identify as white, to me, that is part of the issue, because they created this construct to divide people, to have a class of people that would be quote unquote better than, and a class of people that would be less than. I could never be white, but if I'm Spanish speaking and my skin is light enough, I can graduate into whiteness. There's a picture circulating of J.C. Penney, which makes me laugh, because anybody in this country that understands the one drop rule, you absolutely know that J.C. Penney was a black man. That Plessy versus Ferguson, the man that got on that train could look like you, but got on to challenge this system and had to raise his hands like, listen, I'm black. And that turned into a whole Supreme Court ruling against equality. It's interesting. So I feel like anti-blackness more so than white supremacy, because even that is an oxymoron. Mm-hmm. If you have to yell about your supremacy and it only shows up in terror and trauma, then how great are you? As Toni Morrison, what is good about you if this is your contribution to humanity?
It's such a good point. There's nothing supreme about these people. There's nothing better than about these people. In fact, they're just poster children for how corrupt and racist they are. But it is a real problem because we can't even have the conversation. I can't even tell you how rare it is for me to be able to have this conversation when I'm on a show that's hosted by a white person. It's just, and it's like, hey guys, it's our problem that we created and we perpetuate. It's our conversation to have. But you get into a room with people who are in the majority and in the race, the race that has most of the political power, and it gets completely forgotten about because white people suddenly feel like they don't need to have the conversation. It's so dangerous.
We're talking with Mary Trump, y'all, and to have an opportunity with somebody that studied the human mind the way you have, and of course she's got a podcast. It's the Mary Trump Show. All right, so y'all can check that out. She's got a couple of books, of course. As I'm sitting here with you, I'm challenged with because I'm moving away from talking about race, because I think that actually shuts people down, and that's really not at the core. At the core of it is fear. At the core of it is fear that I'm somehow going to lose something if I engage in this conversation. If I let my children read these books, they're going to know some things, they're going to ask questions, and then I no longer will have the position, and I'll have to explain things that I can't explain. So I'd rather not do that. Is there a way that we can have this conversation without having this conversation, like using the tools of psychology to trick people into actually owning this very thing? And it's not even about owning something, because your grandparents, great grandparents, maybe your grandfather actually did participate in some of this. But in most of y'all listening, you ain't have nothing to do with any oppression of other people. It is a system that we're talking about. How do we remove and separate the individual from the system of incarceration, or the system of racism, or the system of misogyny?
Well, I think part of that, if we're talking about, for example, white people being more open to challenging their own privilege or their own assumptions about race, it's sort of giving them permission not to feel guilt immediately, not to get defensive. Because listen, there's a difference between being racist, which most white Americans are raised to be implicitly, like how can you avoid it with the media, etc., and being a racist, right? And I think when you challenge somebody, they immediately think you're accusing them of being actively bad, right? So the other thing to do, and I tried to do this a little bit in my second book, is just to help people understand, and I'm certainly not the first person to do this. There's been a lot of great scholarship done about how racism adversely affects white people too, in different and sometimes more subtle ways. But think about what we miss out on when we deny ourselves certain kinds of relationships or cultural experiences or allyships, simply because of something as, you said it, race is a construct, or something as arbitrary as ethnicity or your religious affiliation, what have you. So that's part of it. But I think it's also doing something that we're terrible at doing in this country, which is putting things in historical context. The idea of pitting white working class people against Black working class people goes back to the days of slavery, when rich white men understood that if white indentured servants and Black indentured servants and freed Black people became allies, then it would be much, much harder for the rich white guys to get away with what they were getting away with, which is why, white privilege, which was a totally fictional thing, became this very serious currency.
We're talking with Mary Trump. She wrote a book called The Reckoning, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal Atrocities. And I love the healing. You kick off chapter 1 with the story of Luther Holbert and his wife being chased through a Mississippi swamp, through bramble, being captured, dragged back, and the horrors that you spell out, which some of us know because we have books like Without Sanctuary and others in our libraries. Why did you start off that chapter with that lynching and the definition of lynching, which was chef's kiss, masterful? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I started there because it's so visceral and human. And, honestly, the book is written for white people, white Americans, because as you said, like Black Americans know this stuff. White people somehow didn't know about Juneteenth, right? They didn't know what happened on Black Wall Street in Tulsa. So I wanted to start with a very clear personal example of one instance of something that happened countless thousands of times in the Jim Crow era, because it is so easy for those of us who didn't experience that through the generations in our family to forget about it. And another point I thought it was really important to make was, when stupid white people say things like, well, you guys have been free for 200 years. It's like there's something called epigenetics, that trauma is carried through generations. And not only are we talking about the trauma of enslavement, we're also talking about the trauma of Jim Crow. We're talking about the trauma of the new Jim Crow, which Michelle Alexander writes about in her book. We're talking about the fact that the GI Bill didn't apply to Black veterans and the massive amounts of wealth that were lost to Black family, or sorry, I should say denied to Black families. That accumulates over time. It's not like, oh, well, there's a new generation and everything's fine. Those things build up and have impact. And again, if you are not somebody who's directly or even indirectly affected or don't acknowledge that it affects you, then you do need to be taught that history. And I think it needs to be done in a personal, visceral way, because you cannot tell me that the descendants of people who were lynched in such horrific ways, and quite honestly, the descendants of the white people who committed those atrocities are unaffected.
Right. Because as you mentioned, in the crowd of the 600 that swelled to pass around body parts and to take part in this public flaying of two human beings, how does it not? So fast forward, Jerry Jones is discovered in a picture, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, and he was 14, but he's in a crowd that were there to terrorize a group of Black students trying to go to school, trying to uphold the law, actually, right, of Brown versus the Board of Ed. And I was just there to watch. I didn't participate. But isn't your watching part of the trauma? Isn't your watching part of the terrorism? And not to, and again, everyone defending, well, he was 14, but what has he done in his life?
That's right.
To atone for that 14? Because at some point you go, like you, Mary Trump, raising a family where your grandfather is complicated, your uncle's complicated, you have, now, and when I say complicated, I mean racist.
Pretty simple, actually.
Right. Yeah. And I'm not going to mince words, but at some point you go, okay, this was wrong. I'm going to acknowledge the wrong. I'm going to talk about the wrong. And I'm going to demonstrate through my ownership of the team. Let me hire some Black coaches, since that seems to be a problem. Let me do some things. I'm not just going to donate money. I'm going to actually put my money where my mouth is, because I'm not that 14-year-old anymore. I'm a grown man who understands the wrong of that moment.
That's right. And we need more of that. And I know this wasn't a football story, but I know the football player who was, I should know his name, and I apologize, I don't, but again, I only pay attention to tennis. He was asked about something, probably Kanye West. And he's like, wait a minute. Why aren't we talking about
Oh, it was
Jerry
LeBron
Jones?
James. It was LeBron James,
Well,
basketball
okay, then
player.
that's
Yes.
unforgivable
Yes.
that I didn't
Yeah,
remember
no,
it
it's
was
all right.
LeBron James. Even I know who LeBron James is. So, and that's, I mean, that was exactly the right thing to say in that instance, because white people's participation in these things gets completely elided. And so we get to the point where people in positions of power, like Jerry Jones, feel like they don't need to do anything. And our political leaders, our white political leaders, don't feel that it's incumbent upon them to acknowledge that, you know what, America is a racist country. We need to start from there. Otherwise, nobody who is privileged is going to feel like they need to do anything about it.
Maybe we should change the language around it, because racism to me means people don't even know how to define it. Like, I appreciate you defining lynching, but I think racism becomes like CRT, where people don't even really know what it is. Maybe there's something else that would touch the hearts and minds of people intellectually, spiritually, that would be more aligned with what this is, not just unfairness or imbalance, but we're going to sit with that for a minute. If you have something, Mary Trump, let me know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I off the top of my head, I think it's fair to say that this is a country of white privilege.
Okay, even that though is because now again, it's making people recoil from responsibility of we'll think about that.
We'll workshop it.
Yes,
I think you're right. It is important. We need to start, and I don't. Obviously, it's easy for me to say, but I actually don't like having to make concessions like politically when people should just do the right thing. You have to convince them that it's in their own self-interest. But I think sometimes in the long term, that is the better strategy. You don't want to scare them off immediately.
Yeah, I mean, look, Rwanda happened among people who looked alike. I think about, because people convinced these people that these people who were your cousins or what have you are the problem. It's the ability to be able to convince somebody that these people are the problem and that you have a responsibility to take care of them, to build a wall or to hoard them into concentration camps or to lynch them at will. You have a responsibility to protect and preserve the thing that your people built. So first we got to get to the history. Who radicalized you? How'd you get radicalized, Mary Trump? Because you're talking about some things on your podcast that as a woman who grew up in semi-privileged, your dad was an airline pilot, your mom was a flight attendant. I think they called them stewardesses back then. You were raised in the Trump empire. Your granddaddy was a magnate, real estate magnate. And you didn't have to care about these things at all. You could have, was it the disinheritance?
No. I know, because that didn't happen until I was in my 30s. No, it's actually a pretty simple answer. I grew up in Jamaica, Queens. And, my dad grew up in Jamaica Estates. They're right next to each other, but they're light years apart. Jamaica Estates, where my grandparents lived, at the time was like 100% white, very upper middle class neighborhood. And when the first Italian family moved in the 50s, it was a scandal, right? Jamaica proper, where I grew up in the 60s and 70s, was 70% Black and 30% white. So I walked to the subway every day to go to school, and I walked home and I passed by shops that were Black owned, and most of the people I interacted with in stores and stuff were Black, and I would listen to the racism in my family, and then I'd have my own experience as a kid growing up in Jamaica, and I didn't know. Sorry, I was about to swear. I didn't know what the hell they were talking about. Like, what you're demeaning this entire class of people, and that is so far from my experience, it doesn't make sense. And of course, my parents didn't have any Black friends, and everybody in my school practically was white, and it was just this weird cognitive dissonance So basically, I just grew up with this sort of unformed notion that racism was just absolute nonsense, and anybody who subscribed to it was an idiot at best.
Mary Trump, I often said, actually, the first couple of weeks on the show, NBC had a poll that said that 3/4 of white, so self-identified white folk in this country have no relationship with anybody outside of nannies and gardeners and, with Black people. And I was like, that's self-induced. That's a self-induced situation. You choose to move to Utah. You choose to move into Jamaica Estates. You look for the demographics that will not allow your children to brush up against any other. And so there's no surprise if 3/4, that's 75% of white Americans. That's crazy.
That's such a good point. And the other thing that people don't understand is for white people, much of the time it's chosen, but it's also structurally supported by redlining. And again, the GI Bill that kept Black Americans from participating in the so-called American dream of becoming middle class and owning homes and educating their children the same way. So the fallacy is that Black people choose to be among themselves and white people choose to be among themselves when it's been a rigged system all along. So I think that's really such an important point.
What do we do about your uncle running again? What advice do you have? Because he could win again. I said it the first time and everyone was like, oh, it's impossible.
No, it's never. I said this in 2015. I have to be honest. Having known him my whole life and having been a lifelong New Yorker, I didn't think he could win because I didn't understand how people outside of New York perceived him.
Right, because New Yorkers know. They know the grifter.
Yes. But I did say that if he won the nomination, the Republican nomination, just the fact that he had a 0.0001% chance of winning was way too dangerous, and we see what happened. So I'm with you. We don't leave anything to chance, and I think we do everything in our power, whatever that is, to one, make Democrats better, and force Democrats to stop telling people like Black Americans and transgender Americans and other LGBT people and, immigrants that we just need to defer your ability to participate fully in the system because we can't risk it. No. No, Democrats have to do what they're supposed to be doing, which is represent everybody and acknowledge their base and honor their base to the same degree the Republicans empower its just despicable white supremacist, racist Nazi base, right? And I think we need to do whatever we can to encourage Republicans to tear themselves apart.
Yes, like get that pillow man to represent y'all's party and stuff. Yes.
Get DeSantis to run against Donald. That'll be fun.
Oh, I love that. Yes, Mary Trump. I know you have to go. The Mary Trump Show on YouTube and Politicon, your most proud moment on your podcast. Tell us something that will make us tune in.
I have to be honest, I do one-on-one interviews on Thursday nights, but then on Tuesdays, I started doing something called the strategy sessions, which was a small group of different people every week. And then it became the same group. And we call ourselves the Nerd Avengers. And it's just, a group of people coming from different walks of life, different perspectives, just talking really honestly and openly about how to make this country a better place for all people. And I'm really proud of the Nerd Avengers, I have to say.
Well, I would love to have you come back on because we just got a workshop now.
And I would love to have you come on to the Nerd Avengers. I think it would be a blast. You'd love it.
I'm here for it. I think we need more conversations. So Mary Trump, come on back. I appreciate you being here. Get all of her books, but also tune in to the Mary Trump Show. Thanks for coming here today. I appreciate this.